Today's video is sponsored by unicorns, the worst creature in all of fantasy.
The worst!
Hello everyone, my name is Thomas White and this is Thomas Writes. Today we are going to be tier ranking the most common fantasy creatures and races within the genre. I put together this list on my own just based on the creatures that I think are the most commonly seen in Western fantasy. This is not an exhaustive list because frankly there would be hundreds of creatures on here if I were to try to do that. So I'm just going to be focusing on the ones that are most common. Keep in mind that I have lumped a lot of these together into one category just for simplicity and time's sake. I've posted a link to this list down in the description box below, so feel free to rank them yourself and comment below if there are any creatures that you think should have been on this list that were not. With that, let's go ahead and get started. The first creature I have here is Elder Gods, also known as divine beings, things like Cthulhu or Odin or Zeus, basically any sort of otherworldly creature that is so far beyond mortal humans in terms of power and scope. For Elder Gods and divine beings, I'm going to put them in top tier S. Because frankly, the whole idea of something so far beyond humanity that it's nearly incomprehensible to our minds is so cool. It's such a great idea for a fantasy story. You can use Elder Gods as aids to your hero. You can also use them as obstacles. You can use them as these giant sort of overarching villains that are nearly impossible to defeat. It's a good way to add stakes into your story, and it's a good way to add a lot of tension. If the reader feels like the villain is nearly impossible to overcome, it'll add just more satisfaction when the hero does overcome the villain. So overall, I think that Elder Gods and Divine Beings are really cool. I'm going to keep them in S tier because if your story has some sort of Elder God or Eldritch being in it, I'm probably going to enjoy it on some level. Next up, we have dragons. Now, dragons are one of those creatures that are synonymous with the fantasy genre. Dragons are in everything from Aragon to Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Witcher. They're one of those creatures that you see saturated throughout the genre. Because of that, a lot of people find dragons boring, but not me. I love dragons. I'm going to put them in top tier as well because the mystique surrounding dragons is so fascinating and interesting. You also see a lot of stories that do different variations on the dragon. Sometimes they don't just breathe fire, some of them do ice or lightning or earth dragons or wind dragons, all of these different elemental types. You also see good dragons, evil dragons, dragons that are somewhere in between, a bit morally gray. And so there's a lot that you can do with them in a story. I don't think they have run their course. I think you can still do a lot of creative stuff with dragons in a story. So for those reasons, I'm going to put them in S. And frankly, cool factor is a big part of this too. Dragons are just awesome. In almost any shape and size, dragons are cool. Therefore, I'm going to put them in S tier. Next up, we have dwarves. Dwarves are another one of those races that you see a lot in fantasy, from Tolkien to The Witcher to, I think, Game of Thrones, if you count Tyrion. But dwarves are pretty common throughout fantasy. They're typically characterized by being greedy, very skilled craftsmen living underground. All of these elements add a mystique to them of mysteriousness, while also they are typically very rugged, very good warriors. They can be good, but they can also fall into almost evil category if they are so greedy, like in Lord of the Rings when they unearthed the Balrog because of how greedy they became and how far deep they had dug into the earth. For dwarves, I'm going to put them in A tier because I think they are a pretty solid concept. Sometimes they can be done poorly if they are just purely characterized by being stubborn, greedy, and that's all that there is to them. I think they need to be nuanced. I think authors need to do different takes on dwarves. But overall, I still like the concept. I used the picture of Gimli from Lord of the Rings because he's probably my favorite dwarf in fantasy. Just his personality, he's funny while also a good warrior, and he's a loyal friend. I'm sweating like a pig. It's hot here in Texas, I'm sorry. So for dwarves, I'm going to put them in A tier because I think they are a solid concept. Just need to be fleshed out a little bit more in certain stories to make them interesting. Next up, we have elves. Elves, once again, very common in fantasy. You see a lot of different types of elves in modern fantasy, not just kind of the hoity-toity elves that are above everyone, but you also see dark elves, elves that relate to the moon, elves that relate to the sun, elves that are closer to the earth, elves that are closer to nature. Elves are one of those creatures that I think you can do a lot with. The problem with elves is sometimes they get too characterized by being high, mighty, perfect angelic beings that can do no wrong, and oh, mortal men, how evil they are, meanwhile we're so perfect. That kind of stuff makes them boring, and it makes it hard for readers to connect with them. Overall, once again, elves I think are a good concept because there's a lot you can explore with them in terms of connection to nature, having these similar to dragons, these otherworldly beings that give a certain level of mystique to a fantasy world. So I'm going to put them in A tier, and I think I'm going to put them above dwarves just because I think there's a little more that authors can do with elves as a concept versus with dwarves. So I'm going to keep elves up in A tier. Next up, we have fairies or fae creatures. They are typically characterized by being heavily connected to nature. These can include sprites, pixies, nymphs, dryads. There's a lot of different variations on fairies. To be honest, fairies are one of those creatures that are not super fascinating to me. Often they're characterized by being the innocent creatures in a world full of evil humans. And certain stories are able to play on that concept well. But from what I've observed, most of those kinds of stories kind of play out the same way. Human goes, meets a fairy, learns to be softer and more open, and has to fight back against man. I kind of think of the James Cameron Avatar movie as basically just fairies in space because they're these creatures that are so connected and intertwined with nature and are innocent and great. But that being said, fairies, if done well, can still be cool. I used a cosplay of Tinkerbell from Hook as an example because what I like about Tinkerbell, this may sound weird coming from a guy, but what I like about Tinkerbell is that she is a fairy, but she's not perfect. She's sassy, she's sarcastic, she gets jealous, she's very human in her emotions. So for those reasons, I'm going to put fairies in B tier because I don't think they're a bad concept. They're just one that need to be fleshed out a little more. I've also seen a lot of images online of fairies in battle armor, which is such a cool idea. I want to see more stories with warrior fairies. I think that would be awesome. Next up, I have giants. Giants are one of those creatures that you don't see a whole lot of in modern fantasy. They're more common to classic fantasy. But I kind of wish giants were used more in modern fantasy because I think the idea of a giant being this massive humanoid creature that sees the world on a whole different playing field than humans is a really cool idea. You can use them as good guys, like in the BFG, or you can use them as these big evil threats, like in Attack on Titan, is basically a giant apocalypse, which is a cool premise for a story. They're very underutilized, and I'd like to see more of them. I'm going to put them in B tier. Do I want to put them above fairies? Yeah, Yeah, I'm gonna put them above fairies because I love giants also in Norse mythology. They convey this otherworldliness, and they're just cool opponents for a hero to fight against. Because when a hero takes down a giant, it just feels like such a big accomplishment. I'd like to see more giants in stories, but because they're less prominent and not as much of creative stuff has been done with them, in my opinion, I'm going to keep them in B tier. Next up, we have hobbits or halflings. Obviously, the big standout for this is Lord of the Rings. The hobbits are a really fun culture. They're basically supposed to be analogous to England in Tolkien's day, where everyone is just sitting around concerned about smoking their pipes, telling stories, reading books. They live a very simple, modest lifestyle that is very appealing to a lot of people, especially myself. I don't know if a ton of interesting stuff has been done with halflings. The only other good example I can think of is in D&D. Halflings are often bards or rogues or burglars. They play these special roles that are unique to their size and their shape, but they're not a bad creature. I think I'm gonna put halflings. I'm gonna put them in C tier because it's not something that typically attracts me to a story, but it's also not a bad concept either. It's just kind of average. It's just average. Do Smurfs count as halflings? I don't know, but that's neither here nor there. Next up is hybrids. This is a category that I kind of came up with to describe creatures that are half human, half animal of some type. The example I have in the picture is of a centaur, but I would also include fawns or minotaurs in this category as well. Also, lizard people, not the conspiracy theory kind, but the Skyrim kind. Same with cat people, like in Thundercats or these various different animated shows. Hybrids are a really cool idea. I think there's a lot that you can do with them as a concept. You can play around a lot with mixing human and animal cultures with them, which is super creative. So I'm going to put hybrids in A tier because I think there's a lot of variation you can do with them. With hybrids, it can include everything from Mr. Tumnus in the Chronicles of Narnia to the Minotaur in Greek mythology. I also think centaurs are one of those creatures that are very underused. I love them in Chronicles of Narnia, and I would love to see more fantasy stories use centaurs because they are so elegant. They have the elegance of a horse while also the strength of a man, and that's just such a cool idea. I'd like to see more stories use centaurs. I'm going to keep them up in A tier because, again, I think with hybrid creatures, there's a lot you can do with in terms of your storytelling. Next up, I have merfolk, which would include mermen or mermaids. Sirens could also probably fall into this category as well. I chose Aquaman for the picture because it's hot take. It is one of the best DC movies out there. Don't at me. And I just really like Jason Momoa as Aquaman. I think he's one of the coolest examples of a mer person done well. Merfolk are pretty cool. The only thing that bugs me about merfolk is they often fall into the same aesthetic design, where a lot of them are going for that Atlantean look by being based off of Greek myth and the god Poseidon. So a lot of them have a trident, a lot of them have this Greek iconography. I like stories that use merfolk in a more alien sort of sense, like more of a creature from the Black Lagoon sort of sense, where it's this like half human, half fish person that's kind of awesome, but can also be kind of creepy. I think I'm going to put merfolk at top of B category because they often fall into the same kinds of tropes, but the idea of basically humans that can live underwater, you can do a lot of creative stuff with that. I would like to see more stories that use merfolk that get away from the Greek iconography and maybe delve into some other mythologies. If you know of stories that do this, feel free to comment down below so I can check those out. As it stands, I'm going to keep merfolk in the B category. Up next, we have orcs, goblins, or trolls. I kind of lumped them all into the same category because they typically fill similar roles within a story. They're often the big bad's army of darkness that's going to conquer the world. And as such, they can typically fall into the stereotype of just being the big bad evil race that is inherently evil and there's no sort of nuance to them. But you do see stories like the Warcraft games, for example, which take the orc concept, but they make them more nuanced. They're not explicitly evil or good. So I like it when authors do that with the story. But even if they don't, the orcs in Lord of the Rings, for example, I really like, just because the whole idea of this army that has been bred out of the earth and out of mud and birthed in caves, and they're kind of human, kind of elfish, but a weird sort of hybrid of their own thing, is really cool and fun. I also just like the orc aesthetic, how a lot of them use bones as weapons and wear different gruesome things on their bodies. That may sound a little bit morbid, but I just like the way orcs look. The fact that they are so savage that they will eat their own given the chance. I'm gonna go ahead and put orcs up in a category. I'll go above hybrids. Just because the orcs have been such a staple of fantasy for so long, thanks to Tolkien, thanks to Robert Jordan, who the Trollocs are basically his version of an orc. And again, the aesthetic of them is cool. What you can do with them in a story can be creative. They can be this big evil force, but they can also be more nuanced. So for those reasons, I'm going to keep orcs up in A. Next up is a little bit of a less common one. I included shapeshifters or changelings. You can see these in Dungeons and Dragons. You also see them in The Witcher with the Dopplers. I wish there were more stories that used the concept of a changeling, because I think there's a lot of cool things you can do with them. What does that do to a person's identity when they can assume the look of anyone? Do they have an identity of their own, or can they get so lost in the identity of someone else that they lose themselves? Those are concepts that I want to see more authors play around with. Because they're so underutilized, I'm not going to put them very high. I think I'm going to put them bottom of B tier. Because, again, they're a cool concept. I just wish they were used a little more heavily. Things like Fae and Giants and Merfolk are a bit more established in fantasy. Changelings have yet to become something that you see a lot in fantasy, and I would like to see more of them. All right, next up we have unicorns. And I'm sorry, guys, but I think this is going to be my first hot take. I don't like unicorns. I have never seen a unicorn in a story that I really liked. I never saw the concept used in a way that made me think, wow, unicorns are really cool. I don't even know how to describe a unicorn. It's a horse with a horn that basically is so mystical and magical. Some of them can have healing properties. Sometimes they're meant to convey like innocence, but stuff with unicorns is always very vague and unclear. And again, it's just a horse with a horn. I don't find it to be that creative of a concept. So I'm going to have to put unicorns in D tier. I have never been interested in unicorns. The only time I could think of when I liked unicorns is on the cover of The Last Battle, which is the last Narnia book. There's a unicorn with blood on its horn, which is a kind of a cool image, I will admit. And then also that episode of Gravity Falls where Mabel punches the unicorn. And it's just a really funny episode, and maybe that's mean of me to bring up. But those are the first things that come to my mind when I think of a unicorn. If you can think of good examples of unicorns in fantasy, I would be happy to hear them. Maybe I'll change my mind someday, but for now, unicorns are going in D tier. Next up is going to be another hot take, because next up we have vampires. Vampires are so overused in fantasy these days. I have a personal theory, which is that Dracula as a character from the original novel is a really cool creature, a really cool monster. But when you take the vampire concept and divorce it from Dracula, it becomes far less interesting. Because the whole appeal of Dracula is this elegant, high society persona, this snobbery that he conveys, this sense of authority and power that he conveys in any scene that he is in. And when you have vampires that aren't connected to Dracula, they lose a lot of their mystique. They lose a lot of what is cool about them. And the only other cool vampire I can think of is Silas from the Critical Role series, who is basically just a Dracula knockoff. He talks the same way as Dracula. He has that same snooty, rich person persona. And other attempts at vampires are usually, they're either Dracula knockoffs or they're monsters that have no personality, or it's Twilight. And of those options, I prefer the ones closer to Dracula. Because of that, I'm going to have to put vampires in C tier. I'm going to put them below halflings because there are examples of cool vampires like Dracula. But even so, I just have never been a big fan of vampire stories. And I think the concept has been done to death. Not saying that people can't use vampires in stories, but if you're going to do so, I think you need to add a little more than the bare basics of, oh, they drink blood. Oh, they're undead. Oh, they sleep in coffins. There needs to be more to it than that in order to engage me as a reader. So for those reasons, I'm going to put vampires in C tier. Next up, we have werewolves. Again, like vampires, they've just been done to death. At least with vampires, you have Dracula, who's a really cool character. I can't think of a single cool werewolf. You know what? Okay, I take that back. Bigby from The Wolf Among Us is kind of a werewolf in that he... But even that's stretching it a bit, because he's supposed to be the big bad wolf from the fairy tales. Ah, man. Okay, because purely of Bigby from that game, I am going to put werewolves at bottom of C tier. Because I do like the look of werewolves also. I like this humanoid werewolf that can tear you apart is a cool idea. But for now, werewolves, bottom of C tier. Next up, I put wizards / witches / mages, basically any kind of magic user. And this is a no-brainer for me. I'm going to put this at top of S tier because, frankly, if you have magic in your story, that already cements it as being a fantasy story. And there's just so many things you can do with magic. You can have good wizards, bad wizards, wizards that are morally gray. You can do different types of magic. It doesn't all have to be one type of system. You can have magic that is super in-depth based on mathematics and these hard scientific rules. You can also have magic that's just, hocus pocus, frog appears, or, whatever, pulling a rabbit out of a hat. There's a lot of creative stuff you can do with magic and stories. If your story has magic, it cements it as a fantasy story, and I'm going to like it on some level because it has magic in it. That's just me. That's just who I am. So yes, wizards and mages, top tier, top of S. That's where they belong. All right. Finally, our last creature for today are zombies and the undead. Like a lot of the creatures on this list, zombies and skeletons, mummies, basically any variation of undead creature has been done to death. There's a whole genre of zombie apocalypse stories. Even so, I do think there is still creative stuff you can do with the concept of bringing someone back from the dead and having them be this skeletal, necrotic creature. I've seen stories where it's played more for humor, like in Army of Darkness, and I've seen stories where it's played up more for the horror aspect of it. So I think there is a lot you can do with zombies and the undead. And there's just a lot of fun stuff you can do with it. This may be morbid, but the design of the human skeleton says so much on its own. It kind of speaks for itself. It can convey an extreme sense of horror, and it can also be played up for a lot of laughs if done in a particular style of black humor. So I'm going to put Zombies and the Undead. I think I'm going to put them kind of middle of A tier because I do like them. I do like zombies, and I like skeletons and mummies and all the variations of that. They have been done to death. I will grant you that. But I think there's still so much you can do with them, and there's just so much fun to be had whenever it's your hero facing off against the undead. Or maybe even your hero is undead, in which case that can be really fun too. So I'm going to go ahead and put Zombies and the Undead at the middle of A tier. And with that, that is my ranking of the most popular fantasy creatures and races in Western fantasy. Leave your own ranking down in the comments below. If there are any creatures that you think I missed out on, feel free to leave those down there as well. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.